So hi, I'm Anthony Bosman. I'm here with Matt, and we are going to do an experiment in charitable, intellectually curious conversation. And so I think the goal of this conversation for us is to see if we can talk about issues that are often polarizing or hard to talk about across divides. And today we're talking about faith and some of Matt's faith background and his journey. And I think we'll find we have a lot of common themes growing up, a lot of similar background, but we've kind of diverged in where we're at today and thinking about faith and God, although I'm sure we wrestle with some similar questions as well. So Matt, thanks for being here and having this conversation. And maybe I'll let you just frame the conversation however you want. Tell me some about your background and some of your upbringing with faith.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So I'm Matt Herzl. I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist Christian. And I've since then, in kind of the space of about 20 years, I guess, deconstructed my faith and would now be okay calling myself an agnostic atheist. So I do think, that right now there's a lot of conversations in this space and in Christianity about deconstruction. I mean, I think 10 years ago, I didn't know that that was a word that was used. I don't think it was commonly used to describe people who had lost their faith. And now it's everywhere. So essentially, that's kind of where I'm approaching this from. Is this is an example of just one person's deconstruction. It's important to probably say at the beginning that everybody's experience is very different. This is just, my experiences are my experiences. There's some things about my experience that I definitely know is different from the way that a lot of people experience Christianity. So yeah, I'm interested in kind of exploring those things and seeing where it takes us. And hopefully, my goal is that conversations like this will be constructive and will help people understand folks that maybe are a little bit scary or a little bit too different or a little bit sort of I don't know what we are once we leave the church, but I sometimes feel like we're befuddling to folks.
Yeah,
so
no,
my goal is to demystify that a little bit.
Yeah, I really like this goal. I think in some ways we're trying to model, how can we have a conversation? So I also grew up Adventist. I'm still Adventist. I'm very much involved in the church. But how can I model for my friends, pastors, whomever who are in the church, how we can have these conversations with people who, maybe have left for either personal reasons, intellectual reasons, a whole host of reasons, without it devolving or without it, carrying a whole bunch of assumptions about the other person. How can we just authentically listen to each other's story? So
yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Yep. So I guess I can just give a little bit of background about myself, maybe without getting too in the weeds. I was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist from childhood. Both sides of my family were in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In fact, both of my grandfathers were Seventh-day Adventist pastors, and so it was very much, it was a family, and it was a comprehensive worldview, Seventh-day Adventism for me. So growing up, it was pretty much every part of my life was sort of constructed through the lens of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So yeah, I grew up not going to Seventh-day Adventist schools, but being homeschooled actually. Despite being homeschooled, I was very active in the local church school. My mom was involved with their music program, and so I was kind of over there, 3, 4, or 5 days a week, playing in the gym, doing my homework. So I was very much kind of a part of that Adventist church school system. Grew up, went to Southern Adventist University, spent 4 years there getting a degree, and then went into the workforce, worked for ADRA for 4 or 5 years, which is the Adventist Development and Relief Agency. It's the humanitarian arm of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And kind of saw a lot of the world, and came back. And it was kind of shortly after that I sort of made public breaks with the church, and kind of started going through, I guess I would say, a more intentional deconstruction period. so that's the very broad background and scope of things. But maybe if it would be helpful, I can go through some of the specific things kind of in my childhood that led up to some doubts.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Because I'm kind of curious just from listening to this, like, were you already doubting when you were in an Adventist university? Were you doubting like when you were in this Adventist development agency working for them? I really like what you said at the beginning about Adventism is a comprehensive worldview. I think that's just a wonderful description. I think C.S. Lewis had this description of Christianity where he says, I believe the sun is risen, not just because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else.
mhm.
And so it's the ability of Christianity to help us like see the world. And I think Adventism has taken that really seriously, right? Like
Yes,
how can we
yes.
understand all of reality and history and science and whatever? How can we understand everything through these like meta narratives, these big
Mhm.
overarching biblical stories? Um, and and so I can totally see how that is something that if you grow up in, it kind of sticks with you, right? Like even if
Yes.
you leave it, I think yeah. So I want
Yeah.
to hear about how how the
Yeah. Yeah.
construction
And
takes
it,
place.
and we'll wrap back to that probably a little bit later on, but there is, I think, Seventh-day Adventism, more than a lot of Christian denominations, has that comprehensiveness to
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Is may That's maybe the most positive way for me to describe it. um, and I think that tends to, I think that makes the denomination and the faith sort of a more central part of people's lives, because there wasn't a whole lot of my life that was outside of the church. And so if you lose that, it really is like losing. I mean, I felt like I had lost pretty much my entire identity. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So maybe I'll step back. And so, my parents were both very, very loving, caring, affectionate people. They emphasized going to church. We, had daily Bible studies, the whole bit. Read my Bible every morning, had my daily devotions, then went down and had breakfast, and then had more family devotions after breakfast. And so it was very much I guess it was comprehensive part of my life. Um, and I always felt very loved. I was always very cared for. My family life was good from most of those kind of sort of well-being metrics. Um, I think it was around the time that I was baptized that I started having issues, having questions. At
What
least
age
that's
was
when I
that? It was
first
like
remember.
12 or so.
I was a little early. I think I was around 9,
Okay.
9 or 10. I'm pretty sure it was 9. My dad actually, I grew up. I told you about my grandparents, but not my dad. I grew up in Maryland, right near the General Conference headquarters, and my dad worked there.
Mhm.
So I kind of grew up in the General Conference culture and that Adventist mecca. Um, and so there was kind of a lot of pressure to get baptized, and so I did it around 9, right before, I think, if I'm remembering right, it was right before General Conference session in Utrecht, Netherlands, in, I think, 1995.
Mhm.
So let's see, I was born in, yeah, I would have been 9. Yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's right. Um, so I think it was after I was baptized that I started really tuning into this fact, and I think it was maybe more in the culture around then too. So this was mid 90s, that to be a Christian, you need to have a relationship with Jesus. Like
Mhm.
that was an important part, maybe the most important part of being a Christian, was having this personal, intimate relationship with Jesus. And so after I was baptized, I thought, boy, I'm not sure I have that. I want that. Like, I don't know, how do I get that? And of course, I'd always read the Bible. I knew I could, did Bible bowls. I could quote chapter and verse. I loved like the Old Testament stories of David and Jonathan, and like these are my favorite. I kind of lived and breathed this stuff, but I didn't really have sort of an emotional, relational connection to Jesus, and that really started to bother me after I was baptized. And so, so I started obsessing about it a little bit, and I worried that I wasn't sort of enough for God. And so I started focusing, and of course, this is puberty too. So like lots of changes, all kinds of stuff happening. And I just started feeling like, I could never be enough to like get God's attention and for him to have this relationship with me. And so I experienced this, this absence, and frankly, I'd always experienced it, but I'd never really thought that it was a problem until around that time. And when I started feeling it, I thought, well, you're just supposed to be able to ask, and he's supposed to come into your heart.
Yeah.
I've been doing a lot of asking, and it really started to bother me. And I got into this cycle of what I now recognize as a guilt cycle, a psychological guilt cycle, where honestly, every week, like I would at church, I would like repent of my sins. I would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I can't. I'm. Please help me do better." And then I would do something wrong over the next week, something I felt like it was a mistake, something that was sinful, and then I would do it all over again. And during the whole process, I never felt like God was talking to me or helping me or providing any sort of feedback. And, of course, at the time, none of this wasn't really an intellectual objection. Actually, it was, I wasn't thinking this through carefully as a 10 or 11-year-old. I just felt like I was sort of wrong, and I couldn't connect to this. It's kind of interesting because, I've had people ask me, because I sometimes will say that as a kid, I didn't love myself, which is what I would now say. I wasn't able to love myself or accept myself for who I was. And then they'll say, "Well, didn't your parents love you?" I said, "Well, yes, like of course they did, but I didn't feel like I was worthy of it. And I didn't feel like I was worthy of God's love, because in a way I didn't feel like I was worthy of my parents' love, because I didn't feel like I was worthy of God's love, because this perfect being that is supposed to be accessible to people who just simply ask did not seem accessible to me." And all around, it's like growing up in the church. People talk about having a relationship with Jesus all the time. And so it's like this big club everybody's in, like, everybody's got this relationship with Jesus, and he's treating everybody as his special child. And then I feel like I'm the one kind of out in the cold. And, of course, at the time, it didn't even occur to me that the absence might, the absence might be a sign of actual absence. God was an assumed reality in my life. I never even thought, oh, maybe he's not there. I just thought, oh, he doesn't like me. So
can I ask a little bit about this?
Yeah.
So I totally get what you're saying about the emphasis, especially like in evangelical circles, of relationship with Jesus. That's what it's all at. I'm trying to understand a little bit of like what was manifesting or not manifesting that made you feel like you didn't have this, right? Was it you kept messing up and therefore I can't be in relationship, or I keep messing up and therefore like God's not working in me? Or is it just like I don't have the emotional high that some of my friends have, or like this isn't something that's like animates me in the same way? I'm just trying to understand like what is it that young you is like finding like, oh, why don't I have this, or why do I keep doing like what was that missing piece?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I would say it's overlapping factors, because actually each of those things that you mentioned, I would identify. So the fact that I didn't feel like I was getting assistance. So the behavior that I wanted to change, I wasn't having any success at changing, and I also didn't feel I guess what I would call a spiritual or relational connection to God. So maybe a way to describe this would be praying and feeling like your prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling.
Yeah.
So kind of, you're putting things out, you're praying, and you just don't have that feeling like anyone's listening, or like thoughts are coming into your head that are from God. And, and since, of course, at the time I didn't think about this quite as deeply, but since then I have wondered, when I actually talk to believers, often what people will describe when they're describing being impressed by the Holy Spirit is that sort of thoughts will kind of come to their mind that they feel impressed are from God. And I guess I would say I had thoughts in my mind. I never thought that they were from God. I always thought that they were me. And I didn't trust them because I thought that they were me. And that's something that I'll maybe get to in a second, but I don't want to miss the other. So the other point that I think you mentioned was the emotional high. And I would say that actually, even though at this point in my life, I would say my faith was actually more sort of grounded in the intellectual side of things, because I knew the Bible, I knew Adventist beliefs. I kind of felt like that was solid. It was the relational side that was not solid for me. So interestingly enough, though, even though the relational side wasn't sort of stable, I had a lot of like ups and downs. So this was like part of the guilt cycle, right? So when I would go to church, you'd sing, start singing the hymns. For me, singing, I really like to sing. So that was something that always made me feel, closer to God. So I would get that emotional, like high, quote unquote, when I would sing. And that was actually, looking back on my childhood, singing and music was the only sort of reliable way that I would get that feeling. And I don't know, I don't know what other people, I can't put myself in others' heads and, say what their feelings were like. But for me, that's something that at the time, I felt closer to God, drawn closer to God by music. So yeah, maybe, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah,
they're all sort of overlapping kind of
makes
influences.
sense. Yep.
So, yeah. So I'm trying to think of where I was going to go from there. I had another point I was going to move to.
Yeah. So there was a sense of absence.
Yeah. Maybe the point I was going to move to will pop back into my head. It's kind of difficult to untangle all the threads, because everything there's sort of multiple threads kind of happening at the same time. And so, during some of the same time that I was dealing with the sort of relational, emotional, question of God's absence, I also started to encounter more of like the outside world. And of course, to remind, I was homeschooled, so the outside world, my knowledge of the outside world was more limited than I think a lot of people, at least in practice. I read a lot, so I had a lot of book knowledge. It's kind of the stereotype of homeschoolers, and for me it was true. I read all the time, but like didn't go really much farther than my street. So as I started kind of interacting with more ideas outside of my household and the Adventist church, I started kind of running up against scientific problems. And I started kind of, when I was real little, I wasn't really even aware that there was a tension there. I just kind of assumed, God created the world 6,000 years ago. We're all descended from Adam and Eve. Things used to be perfect, and then there was a snake, and then we, messed it up, and and now we're here. And of course, the Adventist understanding is a little bit broader than that. It puts that as, it brackets that within the great controversy. So that was my framework, and I didn't really question it. And then all of a sudden, I started encountering this stuff. Growing up outside DC, we used to go to Smithsonian museums quite a bit. And so I remember really vividly, I don't recall quite how old I was. I would say I was probably in the neighborhood of 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there. And it wasn't the first time that I'd gone to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, I don't think. But I just remember going through one of the dinosaur exhibits with my mom, and just kind of seeing all of the, the millions of years and the the geologic strata, and like, I just kind of kept saying to myself, well, I know none of that can be true. Like, that just can't be true. Just can't be. And I just I kept repeating it in my head, almost like a mantra, like almost like a chant. So I was like walking through it, like, nope, can't be true. Nope, can't be true. Nope, can't be true. And it really bothered me after the fact. I remember thinking like, well, why should I think that I'm smarter than all of the scientists who must have put this stuff in this museum? I didn't have a very complicated understanding of anything at the time, but it was just kind of like, well, wait, seems like these people probably have done a lot of work on this. Like, why do I think that they're wrong? And so that experience actually kind of jump-started, I would say, an interest in geology and biology that kind of started mildly with me in high school. And at the time, I was on board with a lot of the sort of water canopy models of a young Earth, where there used to be an ancient water canopy, and then it sort of popped, and we had a global flood, and that was responsible for most of the geology that we see around us. And so this was kind of my view, and I started, before that visit to the Smithsonian, I really didn't pay that much attention to it, and then afterwards, I really kind of started sort of paying attention to what people said, and I remember. I had a video. I think it was an earth science course, maybe like my freshman or sophomore year in homeschool, and I think it was a Bob Jones course or something. And they had like these little video, sort of, they look like news, people sitting in front of a news desk and sort of reporting on science, I guess. And they talked about the history of the Earth and talked about geology and evolution, and it kind of started to bother me a little bit. And I remember actually talking to my mom about it one day, and I had been studying in history about World War II propaganda, and I thought, like, I remember saying, I was like, it seems like they're starting with the conclusion, and then they're like figuring out what they can use to support that conclusion. And then, like, earlier in the same book, they told me what science was, and that doesn't seem like that's what science is. So I was like, I was very confused, but I really didn't push it. I didn't, at the time, I kind of like constructed this little sort of YEC model in my head that sort of made enough sense of things that I was able to, like, well, no, I have an answer for that. No, I have an answer for that. And so that held up, I would say, until college. And then in college, I wasn't really too worried about the scientific stuff. I was more worried about just like the social stuff, because I was a homeschooler, and this was my first time like being out in the world and like around other people my age, and having some sort of independence. And I started pretty quickly having some concerns about the school and some of the stuff that the school did. So it was the first time in my life that I'd met some gay people at college. And this was circa 2004, 2005, 2006, somewhere in there. And it just really bothered me. We had kids that were put on probation, kids that were expelled, essentially because they were gay. And I couldn't sort of reconcile in my head how that was supposed to work. And at the time, I would have probably said that I thought something like, love the sinner, hate the sin. So I still thought at this point, I'm still an Adventist. I still believe in God. I still, I still think that gay behavior is wrong, essentially. Not that gay people are bad, but that the behavior is somehow wrong. And I had a Christian ethics class somewhere in here, I think my freshman year. And that was the first time when I started really kind of thinking critically about morality and ethics, and trying to figure out what is it that I like, what does it mean to be wrong? What does it mean to be right? Like, what do these concepts mean? Is it just what God says to do? Are we following commandments? Is morality subjective? Is it objective? It was the first time I had thought about any of this stuff very deeply. And I should say, when I was in high school, I did have some concerns about the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I don't know how deeply I should get into that stuff, but it's essentially the stuff that you would probably think that I would have a problem with. I actually got very hung up on Job, interestingly enough. This was this is something else that I would do sometimes in the middle of those guilt cycles in church. I didn't listen to a lot of sermons in church. I mostly read the Bible or prayed. But we'd read Job in church, like in the pew. And there was one summer in particular, I remember I read Job like pretty much every single week in church. I read Job. And for some reason, I just had it in my head. I felt like there was something about Job, something about the character of God and his relationship to humans in Job. Obviously, it was confusing to me. I didn't really like it. It seemed like, God's reaction to Job's questions was, who is this who darkens my door without knowledge? It's like, and so I thought that I just wasn't understanding it. I thought that there's some deeper level here that if I understand it, it will make sense of all of these questions I have about God's character in the Old Testament and why he seems immoral to me, because frankly, his actions frequently seemed immoral. And I never figured it out. I just sort of ended up shelving it and thinking like, well, I don't know, like God is God. So I guess maybe the only way that the Israelites could be let out of Egypt was for him to kill all the firstborn children. But that seems like a stretch to me, like it seems like there's other ways to resolve conflict than like holding a gun to someone's head. And so it really troubled me on a deep level. And I just kind of kept putting it back, like file it away for later, because I couldn't come up with any good answers. And frankly, the answers that I got from my pastor and my parents were not very satisfying. So anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but in school, in college, in ethics class, I kind of started to think a little bit critically about what justifications do we have for calling actions that are not harmful evil? You know what I mean? So that is what religions often do. Often, at least it seems like, there are taboos in religions that are not explicitly tied to helping or harming humans. They are commandments from a deity, everything from circumcision to, there's these things that are not tied to helping and harming others. And so I started to make that distinction in my head and try to figure out, okay, well, what is our foundation? If it's not, if our moral foundation is not consequentialism and the observable, as best as we can figure out, the observable effects of our actions and whether they help people or harm people, then what is it? And, the answers that I got in that class were that it was, God's character and God's commandments were what defined right and wrong. And that sent me down a little bit of a road into philosophy. And I started kind of getting into philosophy a little bit in college. I started asking some questions, I guess enough that I think my mom was a little bit worried about me. And so I think my freshman year in college, she sent me Mere Christianity, which I hadn't read. And so I started reading Mere Christianity. And boy, that was not the thing for me to read. I know people have very positive associations with Mere Christianity. I love C.S. Lewis. I read all the Narnia Chronicles as a kid, of course. And but boy, his moral argument did not make sense to me. And I thought, man, if this is how Christianity views right and wrong in the world, it doesn't seem like it makes sense of human behavior, frankly. So it kind of, and reading Mere Christianity was kind of a nail in the coffin of my faith. But it was like a literal coffin, because it was all of these questions, and it was the final straw that I was like, okay, if I look at this anymore, it's going to fall apart. And if I poke at it anymore, it's just going to come crashing down. So after I finished reading Mere Christianity, I kind of, I didn't really think about it this explicitly, but subconsciously, I decided not to look into it anymore. that I was an Adventist, that I believed in God, but I didn't really know how the details worked out, and I didn't really know what I thought about a lot of the rest of it.
Mhm.
So I kind of just kept my head down, and I finished school, met a really nice girl, ended up getting married, and some time passed. I would say about 4 or 5 years, and I got my first job out of school working for ADRA. And so I started travel, and it's really, fantastic opportunity out of school. Really fortunate to get a job. Like, it was kind of my dream job, frankly. You get to travel the world and help people. And my degree was in communication, so I was writing fundraising stories and doing videography and photography and stuff to help kind of tell these stories and essentially sell the stories in the United States and raise money.
Mhm.
And it was good. It was great. To this day, I would say ADRA is one of the arms of the Seventh-day Adventist Church that I have basically nothing bad to say about. It was a good experience. It was a hard experience. I traveled a lot, to a lot of different places and saw some hard stuff. I was in Haiti 3 days after the earthquake, and it was kind of some rough stuff. And I think the takeaway from all of that for me was not, I think, what a lot of people might suspect, because to me, I often hear people talk about the problem of evil and suffering, and how that can sometimes make people angry, at God. Um, it it was sort of, I think the best way for me to explain it is, to me, the world looked natural.
Mm.
Everywhere that I looked, there were natural disasters. There were people, religious people, non-religious people, doing good things, doing bad things, hurting people, helping people. And I didn't see a divine hand in it. And more than that, I didn't see any correlation between the behavior that I saw as helpful and harmful and religious beliefs. Even, some of the people that I I learned the most from working for ADRA were not Adventists, and in fact not Christians. Um, and so it obviously opened my world up a lot, a lot. And by the end of it, I just kind of thought, this world makes more sense on natural explanations, I think. But that was sort of an intuition. I had not done any reading. I had not looked into anything. Um, I I was still very afraid of examining my own faith, I would say. Um, and this whole time, I'm working at the General Conference. My wife is working at the General Conference. Um, when we got married, we were working together there for a couple of years before we got married, when we were engaged. And during that whole period, I would say I came to see some sort of behind the scenes, behind the curtain stuff at the GC about Adventist leadership that was not positive to me. I would say that it was during this time that I kind of, for the first time, started to realize that maybe, like, whether or not any truth claims about Christianity or the Seventh-day Adventist Church were true or false, that maybe living like a Seventh-day Adventist was actually not good for me, at the very least. And I actually thought it wasn't good for a lot of the people that I saw around me at the GC, frankly. I was just starting to get kind of an understanding of psychology and emotional intelligence. My emotional intelligence was almost zero before I met my wife, and she has helped with that immensely. and and so I started to see stuff in the people around me, stuff like a reluctance to look at things that made them uncomfortable, um, misogyny in the hallways from folks who write Sabbath school lessons, and just casual sort of mistreatment of people, a lot. And And that's, I think sometimes that is sort of the default reason that people give, people who are, I think, trying to be kind and thoughtful and generous to ex-Adventists. I think that's often the answer that is given is like, oh, well, somebody was kind of mean to you, or, there was a bad experience. And I think that that's often true, frankly. I think that there are people who, it's, I don't want to get too much into talking about this, my specific complaints with Seventh-day Adventists maybe at this stage, but, I think even most Adventists would say that Seventh-day Adventism is a more legalistic religion than many. And that's, I think that's quite harmful. And in my opinion, that's kind of just the tip of the iceberg. But anyway, long story short, when I was at the GC, I saw a lot of this stuff around me in sort of real time. And I was like, well, man, like, I don't want to live like this. And so we kind of hit a hard stop. And, my wife, she was raised Seventh-day Adventist as well, in fact, homeschooled. So we had a lot in common, very kind of similar upbringings in some ways, different in other ways. But she was very much out on the Seventh-day Adventist Church from a pretty young age. But ironically, when we first got together, I think she still felt like she had more of a relational connection with God. She wasn't an atheist or anything. But as we were both working at the GC, we just became more and more frustrated with the church, to the point that we were like, all right, man, we got to get out. And so we ran away, basically. We kind of up and moved to Florida, where we didn't know anybody, had no connections, no friends. We actually were kind of hoping to move out to the Northwest, where I am now. But for a variety of reasons, it didn't quite work out, and I got a good job opportunity in Florida. And so we jumped at it, moved down there, and kind of said, oh, all right, we'll be down here for a couple of years, and then maybe try to move somewhere else, because Florida, at least we thought, was a great place to visit, but we didn't want to live there. So the beaches were great for a while. And during the 2 years that I was in Florida, almost as soon as I moved down there, I felt like I had sort of the intellectual and emotional, physical space to start examining some stuff that I had put in this lockbox for so long. So I did. So I started reading everything that I possibly could. I started just sort of devouring content of every type. I was listening to things. In fact, the job that I had was a job where I was doing a lot of motion graphics, animation. And so I could actually listen to podcasts sometimes while I was doing animation work. And so I would listen to this was, so the timing of this was like 2010, 2011, something like that. No, this is later. I'm sorry, 2015. Yeah, this is like 2014, 2015. So it was 5-6 years ago. And it was kind of a combination of things. It was everything from Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists to hardcore philosophy to, angry atheists on the internet and YouTube. And it was, I have to say, it was really hard. One of the first things that I read when I was like, all right, I'm just going to do this. Like, what's out there? Richard Dawkins' God Delusion. Well, all right, bring it on. I did not like that book. And frankly, I like it less now. I don't think I wouldn't point people toward Richard Dawkins as a particularly sophisticated or capable representative of the non-religious. So, but it was kind of a slap in the face, frankly, and it made me really uncomfortable, even though I wasn't really sure what I thought about God, even though I hadn't had a real sort of quote unquote relationship with him, maybe ever. It was like everything that I ever believed, everything that I ever thought, everything that I built my life on, the reason I went to school, like it was all of this stuff. And, he was calling it a delusion. And I was like, okay, come on, dude. But it was the start of something, and I gradually got into sort of more sophisticated, more nuanced stuff. I think Anthony, Unbelievable show in the UK, radio program where there's a lot of really, I think, mostly very polite conversation, hopefully like this one, between people of different beliefs or different viewpoints. So I found all of that really helpful. Dove into the apologetics. I reread the Bible. I just kind of wanted to reassess everything. And sort of one belief by belief, I discovered that I didn't really have good reasons for the things I believed. And that's not to say that those things were necessarily false. You can, just because I didn't have good reasons doesn't mean other people don't. But I didn't. I had mostly believed these things based on faith, based on trust of other people in my life, a lot of authorities in my life. This is something I've been dealing with more recently, is that I really sort of looked up to a lot of people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church because I was kind of close to them. Like there was, I knew people in the General Conference, and I was a little kid running around, and so I looked up to these people. And as I began to see more and more of the lack of sort of good explanations for these things, it just sort of like, it was like house of cards. And the two things that probably I should draw the most attention to at this point were science and biblical textual criticism. Were the two things that I really spent the most time with. So I grew up as a young earth creationist, so I didn't really understand evolution. I decided, well, I should try to figure this out, and so I did. So I looked into it a lot. The Red Queen by Matt Ridley was a really good resource that helped me a lot in understanding evolution and how it works. And it became sort of progressively more convincing, because to me, evolution and the biologic history of humans answered questions that I'd had my whole life. And it made more sense of the world around me. It was more explanatory for me. Another book that was helpful was, I'm going to forget his name, Sapiens, Harari. Maybe Yusuf Harari. Yeah, great book. I found that really helpful as well, in terms of kind of it's essentially a survey of archaeology and sort of paleontology and the recent history of humans. And it's a really interesting story. And of course, there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of uncertainty, but I found the broad strokes to be quite convincing and even beautiful. And from there, it was just kind of one thing after another. I read some Nietzsche. I had a trip down to Guyana, where the whole flight I was sitting next to, I worked at a Christian organization at this point, not an Adventist organization. The place I worked in Florida was another nonprofit international relief agency focusing more on the Caribbean and Central America. And more of a Catholic background. So that was interesting too. So I got to hang out with a lot of Catholics. And but yeah, one particular trip I was reading like Beyond Good and Evil on a flight down to Guyana, and the guy sitting next to me was just like, he was so skeptical. He's just like, what is that? What? I don't know. You said you're gonna get some bad ideas. Anyway, so yeah, those 2 years essentially. I read everything I get my hands on, and I stripped down my worldview to the nuts and bolts. I lost everything, and I went through a period where I was frankly clinically depressed. I wasn't really aware of it at the time, but looking back, it was for sure. There was about 6 months there where really went down like the existential despair path. I mean, it's what you get for reading Nietzsche, I guess. So, so yeah, I kind of like roped myself back from nihilism a little bit during that first year, and and started sort of reassembling a worldview from what I had left, which was not much. And what I grabbed hold of was essentially a Humean sort of empiricism. That was what made the most sense to me philosophically. I really just wanted to know what was true, and that seemed like the best way to figure it out. So empiricism has kind of been my epistemology of my favorite epistemology ever since. It's kind of what I tend to build other things on, even though I recognize that there are assumptions even there. There's always assumptions. So I started rebuilding a worldview. It took a long time. It wasn't done in those first couple of years. On a family front, all of this was happening relatively behind the scenes. Was not something that I felt very comfortable talking to people in my life about. Maybe for a variety of reasons. Some of them may be my own personality, but I'm maybe a little funny for you, Anthony, because you probably know me since I've been rousing people a little bit on the internet, but historically, I am not a fan of confrontation. So it's really hard for me to have confrontational conversations with people. So I avoided it. And eventually we moved out of Florida, moved out west, got a job here in the Seattle area. And shortly after we moved out here, I kind of came to the point where I was starting to get comfortable calling myself an atheist. And I decided to kind of come out to my parents. I kind of want to stop using that word actually, but it's useful to some extent, the coming out analogy, but I don't know, maybe only to some extent. But I wrote a letter to my parents and told them essentially what was on my heart and where I was at, and tried to give them as much context as I could. In fact, the broad strokes of what we've just been talking about, a lot of that was in that letter. And they reacted very well. They're supportive. They've been trying to be understanding all the way along. And I really appreciate that. And so since then, it's been interesting because what in the outline that I sent you, Anthony, before we started this, there was kind of three phases of deconstruction that I pointed out. The first, I think, was pragmatic, which is kind of like what I was talking about in the GC, kind of seeing like, maybe this doesn't really work for me. Like, even if it's not true, maybe it doesn't work for me. And then in Florida, it was like, okay, well, what do I actually believe? What is the intellectual, rational foundation for my worldview? What can I support? What can I support? To what extent? And then once I kind of went through that phase, I kind of started dealing with like an emotional phase. And I think that's probably backwards for a lot of people. And frankly, a lot of people don't go through all these phases in the same way. Some people just have an emotional, they have a bad experience at church and they don't come back. And that's perfectly valid, that's a valid experience and a decent reason to leave someplace. But, for me, that was not my experience in the church for the most part. Growing up, I was very privileged in the church. And so the church was part of my whole identity. I was the good kid at church. I was the one that knew all the answers in Sabbath school. And so all of that was always a part of my identity. And it didn't really, I didn't have these sort of emotional, I was never angry at the church. I was never angry at God either. But I was never angry at the church. And then, 2020 happened. and it's been such a period of shifting, I think, for a lot of people, sort of re-examining, of shuffling priorities and remembering what's important. And of course, we've also seen sort of a rise in conspiracy theories and sort of the post-truth alternative fact era. And all of that stuff, bothers me, like it bothers a lot of people. And I started to see, and this is this is a pretty important side note to add. In 2020, I was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and realized that I should get on some meds. And so I got on some medication and suddenly sort of discovered my emotional self that I'd been kind of keeping sort of in check for a lot of my childhood. And so that's probably part of the reason that none of this came up before. Frankly, I was too afraid. All the emotional stuff that I hadn't dealt with was just kind of being kept inside. So after I started to deal with that and started to kind of get a handle on my own, on my emotions and understand a little bit about myself, I started to see psychological and behavioral ways that the church impacted my life, and in ways that I hadn't seen before, and significantly deeper and more nuanced stuff, I would say. And at the same time, as I'm seeing these things in myself, I'm starting to see the same patterns in the world around me. People who are allowing sort of cognitive biases to get in the way of objectively evaluating evidence. People who are allowing their wishes, to be the ultimate priority in their life rather than dealing with something that's unpleasant. And I saw all that in my own life. And the reason I thought I was that way was mostly because of the church. And when I see patterns like that in other people, then it concerns me. And so I would say over the past year, I've sort of re-engaged a little bit with the Adventist church, just kind of trying to raise awareness online a little bit about some stuff that I see as harmful or deceptive in some places, from my opinion. So another area to wrap back to is the evolution creation debate, and that's another thing that I've been has been motivating me more recently. Has been sort of communication around that and trying to nail down what the church's beliefs are around that. And and it's frustrating. And so it's been interesting. I have been angry a lot lately in ways that I have not been before. And I kind of keep thinking I'm moving past it, and hopefully I'm almost there, because it's not a place that I want to sit in. And I think it's frequently the case with people who have left religion and found that it was damaging to them. It leaves a lot of scars, and especially for somebody like who's been in it for a long time. And I fully recognize that there's people who have had much worse experiences in religious environments than I have. I mentioned a little bit ago, but it's worth mentioning again, that my experience actually in the Seventh-day Adventist Church was quite privileged. I was the favorite kid in Sabbath school. I knew all the answers. I was trusted by adults a lot, partly because I was homeschooled. There's kind of that homeschool effect that, like, you all your friends are adults and you can't talk to anybody your own age. So I don't know. I guess I'm hoping to move beyond it into something that is a little bit more productive soon, because although it's a natural reaction to be angry, I think, I don't know, it spins out after so long. So I've been talking for a while. I don't know. What do you think about all that?
This is a lot. Thank you so much for sharing. No, I really appreciate it. I appreciate the self-awareness. I think like a lot of these issues you highlighted are like pretty typical, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of what, if I had to guess, like, what would be 5 major issues? Maybe I would have gotten 4 of the 5 or something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
We hit science and like creation evolution issues. We hit issues like sexual ethics, and then you didn't make the connection explicit, but I wonder if that feeds into like issues of the authority of Scripture. I guess both of those could connect.
Yes, actually,
Yeah.
that was the area that I was when there was something that I was forgetting. I wanted to talk about textual criticism.
Yeah. So that seems to kind of at the very beginning, you had this line. You said Adventism is a comprehensive worldview, and if this is the case, then you can begin seeing like if you understand that worldview to entail particular beliefs about the age of the Earth, or what things were like, and then you go to Science Museum and you start getting some cracks in that,
Yeah,
and then that worldview entails something about like what human flourishing looks like and what is like the right sexual ethic. And then you start like, having friends in college who are challenging this, right? And
yeah, right.
like you're on the wrong side of the issue or whatever.
Yep.
And then you have like very central to that worldview is the authority of Scripture. So it's not just that the worldview like corresponds with reality, but it's like internally coherent, right?
Yeah,
And then suddenly you like have an all-living God doing some pretty wild stuff in the Old Testament. I can
yeah,
see how like this just accumulates a collection of cracks.
yeah. And I mean, there's so many ways we could go. And I know we don't probably want to get into anything too deeply, but on the area of textual criticism, that was a big one for me. Bart Ehrman is a name that's always mentioned a lot for good reason. He knows his stuff, and he's a skeptic, and so he tends to say things a little plainer than the more evangelically focused scholarship. And yeah, so I found out all that very useful. Something that was really important for me early on was deciding what I thought about Jesus. So like, what was Jesus? What is the historical Jesus? What about the resurrection? All those central questions were central. And I guess maybe the briefest way to put it is that I came to a view of the historical Jesus as essentially an apocalyptic preacher. Somebody who, and this is kind of interesting. If I ever, do a graduate degree in religion or something, who knows? Maybe my thesis will be around the relationship of the historical Jesus apocalyptic teachings to historical Adventism, because I think there's some interesting connections there. Because I do think that actually the historical Jesus, his message was essentially apocalyptic. I think he thought that the end of the world was coming soon. And just like Adventists do, it's just 2,000 years later. So understanding the historical Jesus and understanding kind of what I thought about the resurrection, what I thought about Paul, those were all pretty important things for me to kind of think through and come to some sort of tentative conclusions, at least about. And it's not this isn't a talk about biblical inerrancy or anything, but for me, as soon as I started looking into it, it was not really. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, to me, most of my life, I didn't really look into this stuff. I just accepted it. Like you said, it's comprehensive. You just accept, what the Bible says is true, what my teachers and parents have said about it and interpreted it in this way. That's true. And for me, basically, as soon as I started looking into it, I realized that I had been misinformed about a lot of things. And that's kind of a tough thing to realize. At the time, it didn't really make me angry, weirdly. It's made me angry now that I'm on the right meds. But yeah, it was a process going through textual criticism, just trying to understand what the evidence was for different propositions, who actually wrote this book. I mean, who do we think wrote this book? I looked quite a bit into Daniel, because Daniel is important to Seventh-day Adventists. So were the prophecies of Daniel written before the events they describe, is a pretty basic question to ask. And I don't think we know, but it sure seems like it could be after. So those kinds of things are, to me, they seem like important things to talk about. And especially from my point of view now, it bothers me deeply that there are still children, being educated in Seventh-day Adventist churches who sort of are not being given the full picture of a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And not intentionally most of the time. It's just it's a top-down thing. The pastors don't necessarily share what they learn in seminary with the people in the pews all the time, for various reasons. It's complicated, and and maybe that is one of my most basic complaints about the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is that there's often, I think, at least apparently, a fear of certain types of complexity, a fear of sort of going up against people with different opinions. At least sometimes it seems like that. I don't know.
So as I was listening to your story, I have a question. I want to explore more, like this current set of emotions and anger and frustration and what some of the elements of that. But a lot of the things you shared, I really identify with. So I grew up going to Adventist, like elementary school, middle school, high school. And so I think I got a pretty good indoctrination into the Adventist worldview, right? I had a number of instructors who were pretty intentional about that. And so when I went to university, I didn't go to an Adventist university. So like my freshman year, I read Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil.
Yeah.
And I took this religious studies class, which had us read a book it's called Who Wrote the Bible, about the authorship of the Old Testament, which presents critical theories of Daniel and how like the pentateuch was put together and the various authorship. And I'd been growing up teaching it was Moses who wrote the first 5 books, and then you have these other theories, and and then science for sure. I think I was more aware of those issues probably already, like going into university, but like I took this archaeology class, and I remember we had a class that the professor spent on conspiracy theories, like aliens built the pyramids and these kinds of things. And he hit like young Earth creationism as one of the conspiracy theories. And I was like sitting there trying to be like, how do I relate to this? How do I understand this? And so, and certainly then like issues like sexual ethic and how to relate to that, and that definitely comes up in university. So I can resonate very much with these elements of your story. I'm really curious about your present anger, and as you're describing some of your frustration, I keep coming back to this story you shared of like when you're in the museum and you're saying to yourself like, this can't be true. And is this the anger that the church is like teaching, either maliciously or not, perhaps goodwill, perhaps it's not intentionally misleading people, but that people are being taught an incorrect worldview that are leading people to have to like turn off their minds, turn off their thinking, and like just not engage with part of reality. Is that part of the concern?
Yeah, and worse than that, I think it's damaging. I mean, I think maybe something that I would compare it to would be alternative medicine.
Okay.
So and that, I'm not meaning to like I know the Adventist Church sometimes has a wing of alternative medicine. I'm not meaning to make that comparison, but maybe the less generous way to put it is a snake oil salesman. But imagine everybody buys the snake oil and they think it really works, and they pass it on to their kids thinking it really works. So they're not lying, they're not being malicious, but it's still snake oil, and somewhere along the line, I feel like there should be a responsible person, someone in a position of authority in the church, at GRI, somebody who has a little bit of, geology. There should be people in the church with the intellectual integrity to say, hang on, like at the very least, we should be making clear that like, well, actually, evolutionists aren't like possessed by the devil. They like, actually, if you look at the evidence, there's a pretty good case. Like, we might disagree with it. There's a lot of, maybe we see this problem, but there's just a lot of what I would call sort of sweeping mischaracterizations and frankly, I've become more strident in some of the stuff I've been saying recently because I've been looking into it more. Like, I told you, I think, before this, that there was a bunch of presentations from the Geoscience Research Institute that I read that kind of set me off a little bit, because it seemed like there was a lot of misinformation, and sort of mischaracterization. I think the word I used was othering. So in addition to the misinformation, there was a lot of like, these people not only disagree with us, but they're bad and dangerous and don't have anything to do with them, or they'll take your kids. And that really bothers me, especially kind of in the current context of the world that we're living in. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from, I think.
So I can see how growing up, you mentioned like Bob Jones University doing something science through them, and I don't know too much about Bob Jones, but I understand like they're a very conservative evangelical. I don't know if the Baptist or whatever.
Yeah, evangelical, I think is fair.
Yeah, and I'm sure they hold to like a very stringent young Earth creationism. So I see this example. Do you, and you've cited maybe some other examples within Adventism. Do you think that's like the dominant, or like this has been like your own experience? Do you have exemplars of either Adventists or other Christian scientists who are a lot more moderate in their claims?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I would point to Biologos or Reasonable Faith, or honestly, there's quite a few Christian apologetic organizations that deal with creationism that I don't have a lot of complaints against, frankly. Because I feel like they deal relatively honestly. So it's really the intellectual integrity and the honesty that gets me. And to some extent, the anger has come both with emotional sort of, I don't know, unlocking, but also I think with confidence, because the more I've looked into this, the more I realize how bad the mischaracterizations are. So, I'll hang out in forums where I'm seeing actual geologists talk about this stuff, and I realize that there's really not much of an argument here. And so, yeah, it kind of leaves me in a place where I'm just kind of like struggling to understand how some of the materials, and here I'm particularly talking about young Earth and flood geology, in particular. So I'll try to represent what I'm hoping the Adventist Church will do and be precise in my terms. There's a lot of different types of creationism, right? A lot of variations of belief. It's not all the same thing. So flood geology, as the Adventist Church has traditionally understood it, I think is problematic. I think it's actually been falsified. Essentially, the idea that the flood is the cause of the geologic strata that we see, I think has been pretty much falsified. So there may have been a flood, but it didn't, like the idea that like there was this flood, moved everything around, laid everything down. Like, I don't actually know anybody who is still even suggesting that, who is like a geologist.
Yeah, so I wonder if there's something going on here. And so I'm going to like suggest a possible explanation, and then you can like respond and tell me that maybe this is a bad or a good explanation. And it's not to like get anyone off the hook or say like this is like makes it less or more moral or anything like this. Like maybe it's still a bad scenario. But I wonder if part of what's going on is like we have a scientific literacy problem, like not just in Adventism, like in the general public, right? Like not very many people understand science very well, or often are particularly interested in like going very deeply into these models. So, like there's one aspect of context, and then aspect two is there are these culture wars that go on where the godless evolutionist or versus the whatever, right? Like you have this like culture wars going on at the same time, and I wonder if what happens is you end up with in terms of like Okay, what is the Adventist Church position? Well, the Adventist Church as a whole says very little, because it's like we have a few voted statements, but like typically the way the Adventist Church speaks is there are some people within Adventism who get a big following, a big platform, and
Yeah.
they speak. And those who tend to have the big followings, the big platforms, maybe don't have a very robust understanding of knowledge of science, and so the messages they broadcast are things that feed into like their side of the culture wars, and they're not particularly scientifically rigorous because they don't have to be, because people are not very scientifically informed and they're
Yeah.
probably not very scientifically informed. But I think like within Adventism, like I think of my friends and colleagues who are geologists or who are, you know, like study these things. Um, I think they know, right? And like I think they understand like the Earth.
Why aren't they talking about it then? That's my question.
I think they do.
Okay.
Let's just take a couple examples. I think within Adventism, there's a number of voices who have been very vocal about like the age of the Earth, and I think like when in Adventism we have a pretty comfortable, and I don't know, like maybe in some local churches in some local contexts it's not the case, but I think in most of our institutions we're very comfortable with an old Earth, right? So it's like an old Earth, young life distinction, right?
That wasn't my experience, honestly, but maybe.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So this is really interesting because I mean, I think even many of like there's a recent commentary on Genesis that just came out that's very comfortable, like from our theologians, not even a scientist, with affirming Genesis 1:1 is just God created the earth, and this can happen, you know, however long ago, and there's no trying to pin it down to, you know, 6,000 years, anything like this. Now, I think what happens is like when these things, like as you trickle further and further away from um, people who care about and study this to the general public, where there's generally less of like a science enthusiasm, with lots of counterexamples, like yourself and others who actually care about this. But you know, probably you can imagine like in a general like local church of 500 people. I mean, how many people really care and study science that much? I don't know.
Sure.
And so I think there's something that happens where it's like, as you trickle further out, the complexity gets lost.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's hard to sustain those complex models. And so
Yeah.
like, you can go to places like BioLogos or wherever, and they have like very nice models that bring in, you know, like we can affirm evolution, but still affirm God as creator. But I think when you start moving too far out, in the general public, especially in America, there's a strange, like either God created, or it's like these things are pitted against each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Which they shouldn't be.
Careful partitioning of, well, what aspects of evolution can we affirm, and what aspects of what does it mean for God to be creator? What does it mean to even view these things in Genesis as historical? You know, like maybe there's many ways we can understand these historical events that won't necessarily be the packaging of Bob Jones University or
right. Yeah.
Of your favorite Adventist speaker who goes on and, you know, gives his "my grandpa's not a monkey" argument or whatever.
Right.
I don't know if that's a like a more charitable take. Maybe that's too optimistic.
Well,
yeah,
I think so. I guess what I would say is I agree with all of that. Like there is a scientific literacy problem, and that is why I think this is more important. so like to go back to my example of like the alternative medicine. So like in COVID, the Adventist Church has done, in my opinion, a pretty decent job of messaging affirmative things, clarifying scientific evidence about the COVID vaccines. On the Adventist Review website, you know, folks that I used to know from from the GC are, you know, writing stuff saying, hey guys, here's the evidence. You should think about it. You might want to go get your vaccine. So what they're doing is they are countering dangerous false narratives and dangerous misunderstandings. And they're doing it because those people are responsible, knowledgeable experts who can use their influence for good. So I would want them to do the exact same thing around the science and faith debate. And I think that they do the opposite. So in fact, I could point you to some recent editorials in the Adventist Review from folks at GRI
Yeah.
who write these long, pretty things, sort of affirming, we know the true story. We know exactly what happened. It's exactly like the Bible said. And then they don't give any details about how they actually integrate that with science. And they never do, frankly. I mean, in these essays and these appearances, they make very vague statements. And I think it's muddying the water. I think it's like a doctor saying, well, it's very important to address disease, and there's all kinds of ways we all deal with disease in our own ways, and what works for you might work for you, and it's to me it's irresponsible.
Yeah. No, I see the critique and I feel the force of it. Um, I wonder how much though, like this is like a cultural critique, right?
Sure.
This is we need to be more responsible in how we communicate our understanding of creation in a way that doesn't fall into like straw man representations,
Yes,
that vilify like scientists or anything like this.
yes.
And we need to do a better job of like affirming scientists in the church and giving them a platform and opportunities to wrestle through these things. And so it's like, great, there's a cultural critique there. I'm with it. Like I agree. I don't, I'm in mathematics, so I don't have to deal with as many.
Yeah, there's less controversy for
Yeah, yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But I've done like a few presentations and like on Genesis and things, and in those I try to go out of my way to, um, don't think there's any issue like the Big Bang in Genesis, right? Like I don't see any. I don't think there's an issue like a 14 billion year old universe,
Right. Yeah.
anything like this. And so I try and sketch that. But I also realize like when I'm speaking to a broad audience, I do like simplify. I have to,
Hmm.
because it's like that's just the nature of like scientific communication to a broad audience where people don't necessarily have
Sure.
the background
Yeah.
or necessarily the interest, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But you're right, particularly in our educational system, we would hope to have opportunities for people to engage with those kinds of questions.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so there's this cultural critique, I think, of scientific communication, and that's very compelling, and I'm behind entirely. And I think some of the other critiques maybe are in a similar direction, like the way a particular college or university or other institution like treats their LGBT students. Like, yeah, they probably did a crummy job of it, particularly back in 2000, whenever it was 5 or 10 or whatever. Like, I have no doubt that it was probably they did a really crummy job of things. Maybe there's also a doctrinal critique there. Maybe it's also like the church needs to rethink its understanding of sexual ethics. Although within Christianity, there's lots of different understanding of how we relate to these things. So I think that's
I think there's actually a doctrinal critique. I think there's actually a moral critique of Christianity in there.
okay.
Christianity completely, but that's probably a deeper subject than we want to get into right
Sure,
now.
sure, sure. No, but I'm just trying to wrestle through like what is it that leads one not just to say, the church has done a really crummy job with this stuff, or some of the particular doctrines here are a little bit off. But what was it that's really like, no, I think actually like this a more fundamental problem, right? And
Yeah.
so what is that one? And you had mentioned like textual criticism. So maybe that's it. Maybe that's like when you lose confidence in that the Bible is, but still like that would lead me to wonder like, um, why not just like I mean, there's various kinds of theism or whatever. Like where is it where it's like, okay, I'm going to like go a little bit further than just being like the church is crummy, or I don't know if this denomination got it all figured out right, to actually being like, let me go a little bit one step further. Like what? Help me fill in that gap if you can.
Well, I'm not sure if I know exactly what you're asking, but
Yeah.
if you're wondering where, like, why I sort of went all the way to
Yeah.
atheism rather than stopping it. Okay.
Yeah.
So basically, basically science, honestly. When I kind of, the more that I kind of began to learn about the limits of science, and sort of what science is able to discern and what it's not, I began to get more and more, at first worried about what that meant for my worldview. And eventually, after I kind of was rebuilding my worldview, I began to understand sort of what types of deities might work within my worldview. So in other words, we have this set of observations about the world. What conceptions of God or supernatural sort of could possibly be compatible with what we see around us?
Mm-hmm.
So that's ultimately the question that I would get to. And my ultimate answer was that I can't see how an interventionist deity would work in this cosmos that we are in.
Yeah. Okay.
So an interventionist deity would be a critical point for me. So I am atheistic on different levels depending on what concept of God you're suggesting, right? Sure. So the Judeo-Christian deity I am atheistic about. I am quite confident that those things that are recorded in the Bible about the children of Israel did not happen exactly as they happened. I don't think that God existed or worked in history in the way that is recorded. But
not only in the way it's recorded, but like you don't think at all, right? Because if you have
yeah.
intervention, then
yeah. Well, I wouldn't say at all, because I would like to leave a little bit of room for miracles, because I don't know for sure if I have sorted out in my head exactly what the limits of miracles might be. So, for instance, if the laws of physics were to be temporarily suspended in some way, I mean, we're assuming an omnipotent being, then I'm not sure that I would feel comfortable saying, well, then there is no such thing as supernatural. What I am more comfortable saying is that in the normal course of physics, as we see it working around us, there is no pathway by which information could get from the natural realm to a supernatural realm. So sort of physically,
this is like a mind-body dualism problem.
It is,
right?
Yeah.
So like,
but I mean, it's more than that. But yeah, essentially, yeah.
No, but like the same critique that there is, so you have Descartes' dualism, and then the critique of it is like, how can a immaterial soul
exactly
kind of like causal agency over?
Yeah, it's the old Princess. What's her name? Princess of Bohemia. Blanking on her name. She had a famous series of letters correspondence with Descartes on mind-body dualism, and yeah, that was her objection.
Yeah, that's right. And now you're just extending it from the mind-body problem to like God and the cosmos.
Right. And I would say that now we have much stronger reasons to believe that there can be no connection between that, even if a supernatural, whatever that is, even if there is some other realm that exists in our ontology, like even if it's difficult to see how, based on the things that we see around us in the world, how any information from that realm could get to ours and vice versa. Because
why? Like, what's the problem for you? Why don't you think that can happen?
The standard model of physics, basically. So it's difficult to understand by what mechanism, if something is affecting our psychology, then that, if God is, okay, so let's be specific. If God is inspiring thoughts in our minds, if we pray to God and he inspires something in our minds, he's quote unquote speaking to us. That thought there's still some blanks to be filled in about consciousness, no doubt. But one way or another, the material of our brain is associated with that thought. So it's difficult to understand. There's nothing that is going to sort of push the material in our brains around. Basically, since the discovery of the Higgs boson, we have a more or less complete version of physics for the realm in which humans live and human psychology takes place.
Yeah, there was just an experiment this last week that draws some things into question. But I'm with you. I'm happy.
Well, no, actually, it doesn't. So this is important to describe. That sounds like a big claim, and I should say, for anybody, if anybody ever, I don't know who's ever going to see this, but if anybody ever sees this and you want to look up Look into Sean Carroll's stuff. He's a physicist at Caltech. Most of this stuff that I get comes from him and his talks.
Sure.
I'm not a physicist. My understanding is that essentially, since the discovery of the Higgs boson, we now have a complete description of all of the forces in matter of which we are made and that affect us. That's not to say that everything in physics has been discovered, because it certainly hasn't, just like that discovery you're talking about at CERN.
Yeah.
So for instance, like the example that he uses and the one I usually use is dark matter, right? So like we don't know what dark matter is. Like we have no idea. There's a bunch of theories, we don't know. But dark matter, whatever it is, we can't measure it on Earth. The only way we can measure it is when we look at the entire universe and we try to, add up gravity and add what we can see, and there's a discrepancy. So when we look at the scale of humans on Earth, we can't actually detect dark matter. It's streaming through us at massive rates every second, but we can't actually detect it. And the reason that we can't detect it is because it doesn't interact with us. So in physics, what you detect, what they're looking at is the interactions, the particle interactions. So what you can't see is not interacting with anything. So what the implications of that, as I understand it, is that what we can't see does not affect us. It might affect the formation of galaxies. So I guess you might say, well, from that point of view, it, maybe dark matter has something to do with galaxy formation. And if galaxies didn't form, then the solar system wouldn't have formed and Earth wouldn't have, aggregated or whatever. But generally speaking, so this is like on the scale of humans, the claim is that physics is completely understood within this limited domain of humans and human psychology. So I don't know that that's right. Maybe it's not, but that is a claim that Sean Carroll makes, and I haven't seen a whole lot of physicists disagree with him.
Let me just grant that. I think that's for simplicity. Let's just say you're right. Suppose we have a pretty compelling physical description of the world around us. I'm trying to understand, are you getting towards like some kind of determinism here?
Yes, I'm a determinist, yeah.
And okay, wow, okay, so this is interesting. So then that leads to lots of questions. One is, would you consider yourself a compatibilist as well?
Yeah, I'm a compatibilist, yeah.
Okay.
So go ahead and ask your question, yeah.
No, because the question is, how does God have agency in the world? And now I'm curious how humans have agency in the world. Right. So that and if we can understand that if humans agency, the question is, can we bootstrap that up and then say?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, so what I would say about human agency is that, or human free will, is that free will is a way we have of talking about humans, and that doesn't mean that it's not real.
It's an emergent property that's emergent complex.
It's an emergent property, and I think a lot of the time when we talk about and obviously this isn't the first time you've heard this, but when we talk about emergent properties, I think a lot of the time we kind of tend to think of like one of the examples is like chess. Like it's a game that we decided, but chess isn't not real.
Yeah.
But yet chess is something that we invented. And so I at some point I think those examples are a little bit poor. I almost prefer to think about emergence on the level of like fluid dynamics.
Yeah.
So it's water is real. Like it's real hard to say water is not real. So I don't think, there was a time 3 or 4 years ago where I probably would have gone a little farther down the reductionist line of thinking. And I've pulled myself back a little bit from that. So yeah, I think it's fine to talk about things like human free will, because we are agents. So, explanations for things exist within context, and within the context of human agents doing human things, then free will is a perfectly, fine concept. If I was, a Laplacian demon, then it might not make sense, but I'm not. I'm a human. So.
Yeah. Okay. Do you feel
that's a very brief touching on determinism?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I don't know how much further to go down this, but maybe I'll just ask so I don't have to ask all the questions. Like, do you feel like the weight of determinism, like how expensive of a worldview this was like a very...
I did. Yeah, I did for a while. In fact, up until last summer, and I got some tools that helped me deal with it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
there's a
It was
lot
not,
of
it's
things
not a
that's really
pleasant,
hard to work through under
it's
determinism.
not yeah, I don't think it's an appealing, I don't think it's an appealing place for people to end up. I think,
Yeah,
frankly, all right, to be completely honest,
yeah,
most of the beliefs that I have changed in the past 10 years, I have not wanted to change.
yeah,
Like, they have pretty much each one been something that I didn't want.
yeah.
But once I started looking into things, it's like, well, okay, am I gonna keep lying to myself or not? And like, once I learned this stuff, then it's like, well, okay, you can't just deny, at least I couldn't just deny stuff. So it really sort of did kind of, it's not always it. I heard somebody else say this, that like, it's hard to point to the rewards of atheism, of
Yeah.
like, of
Yeah.
leaving religion. That's intellectual honesty is kind of it, I guess. I mean, I think I have a better understanding of the world than I used to,
Well, if religion was
but maybe
causing
not.
anxiety, if religion's causing these other things,
Yeah,
it could
yeah,
be.
that's true. Yeah, that's true. You get rid of some of the harms,
If
maybe. Yeah,
religion was feeling like it was constraining how you can live your life or something, you no longer have
sure.
these constraints on you. Um, so there's a number of ways that even if one holds to determinism, so like I want to be very generous and even grant that if one even holds to determinism, although I'm a pretty big advocate of libertarian free will, and so which I don't think you can make compatible. I think you would have to have a free will that like by definition, libertarian free will is the freedom to have done otherwise, which
Yes.
you
Yeah.
can't do with determinism. Um, because it just seems so darn obvious to me.
A
But
lot of things seem obvious.
yeah,
Flat
yeah,
Earth seems obvious to some of us.
perhaps one of my deepest intuitions are wrong on this, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I've had to run completely, like, seriously. It's been my determinism and morality have been the two hardest areas for me to deal with.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
they intersect in meaningful
they
ways.
do,
Yeah,
yeah, they do, and it's the things that have helped me. I don't know if, unless I'm talking to anybody who's really like down the determinist road, this may not be useful to people.
yeah,
But if
yeah,
anybody's there, so the things that helped me were, one, realizing that I am not a Laplacian demon. Like, there is no context in which I can have all of the information in the universe and be able to make calculations about the future or the past. If that context existed, it wouldn't be me,
yeah,
by definition. So that helped me a little bit. And then what really helped me was sort of the associated thought that if the future is determined, well, I don't know what that is. So for instance, in any given instant, you have to act like people have free will.
yeah,
So this is something, because this is what I was thinking about, was criminal justice, right? So, because there's implications for everything and
yeah,
determinism. So I was thinking about criminal justice and, accountability and responsibility and all this. And if you think about something like, imagine sort of a restorative justice program where, somebody goes out and commits an armed robbery, robs a bank,
Mhm.
and they're apprehended, they're convicted. Maybe instead of jail, they go to some kind of a program where they receive counseling. They go through some kind of a rehabilitation program. Um, in a deterministic world, like, why would you do that? That was my thinking. So like, well, if it's all determined, like, why would you even bother? Like, why even? And then I'm like, well, wait, again, I don't know. So determinism does not mean that like always the same thing happens. Determinism just means that there's a causal chain
Uh-huh,
and that you couldn't have done otherwise.
uh-huh,
So it doesn't mean that you know what somebody's going to do in a specific context, in a specific situation that hasn't yet occurred. So somebody robs a bank, if your thinking is, and this is what my thinking was, well, if in a deterministic universe, that person who robbed the bank will probably just rob another one. But
uh-huh.
that's not what that means. In a different context, after getting treatment and being convicted, we don't know what he might do. He might go back and rob another bank, or in that context, after receiving those things, having those experiences, then the context of his mind and his behavior is
Yeah,
different, and he will
yeah,
be determined to do a different thing. So functionally, it really, I don't think, changes much, despite being extremely counterintuitive.
The legal theory has to change. So no longer would punishments be like morally punitive or something.
Right. No, punitive punishment would have to change.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So that would have to, because it's like it's hard to think of them as a responsible agent in the same.
Right. Yeah, because we are, if I was Hitler, I would be Hitler. I wouldn't do otherwise than Hitler. If I had all the same experiences in my life as Hitler, I had all the same, inputs, then that's just who I would be. I had the same biology, all the same experiences, then that's just who I would be. So yeah, that's kind of where I've ended up with it.
But so deeply counterintuitive to me. But
it is, and it's counterintuitive to me too. Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think a lot of, but this is the thing, right? Like the deeper we go, the more we realize that a lot of things about reality are counterintuitive. Like most things, honestly. I mean, if we go to a deep level, the world is just wave functions. Like, it's.
Oh, so let's talk about the wave functions. No, I wanted to get back to, like, I don't know if determinism, even if we grant determinism, which like is a big ask, but even if we do that, I don't know if that rules out divine intervention, right?
Maybe not. And so, and that was why I made that point about miracles, because I don't actually, I'm not sure I have clear in my head right now how. It seems like, I'm not inclined to be skeptical of the idea that an omnipotent deity could sort of sweep aside the laws of physics and do something. Yeah, well,
there's I don't even know if it's sweeping aside the laws of physics, but it's like feeding new information into the system that will then lead things to act in a different way. Or it could be even leveraging the laws of physics, right? If at some level wave collapse is fundamentally probabilistic, then there's a lot you can work with, right? So,
sure.
A number of ways in which one could recover divine.
Yeah. Direction. Well, that's actually interesting. That's an interesting thought, because that's a way in which free will might be different for God than for us. Yeah. I think that's it. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, you're good.
No, I was just gonna say it's interesting. One of the ways that I like to, one of my arguments for determinism is essentially I'm not trying to kind of provide detailed arguments here, but essentially that if quantum mechanics is true, then it seems like the universe is either deterministic or random, right? So, but even if it's random, then you have a random sequence of events that are responsible for whatever the current state of affairs is in your behavior. Yeah. So it's either a deterministic or a random sequence. And in neither one of those scenarios does it seem like we have room for free will without, like you're saying, like if we could solve the mind-body dualism problem, or I actually just saw, this is a real tangent, but I just saw something the other day that was suggesting some kind of an EM field as a mechanism in consciousness, like a low-level EM field that interacts with your. It's very strange. Yeah, there's always, when you get into consciousness, you always get into some pseudo stuff.
So I think that is exactly the problem to address with free will, is what is free will if it's not either predetermined action or random action, right? And I think the answer is it's a free action, so it's a third category. and so the question is, does this third category exist in the universe or not?
Right.
And it's very hard for me to conceive of a world without free will, because it seems so essential to my life.
Yeah, it's eminently apparent. Yeah,
apparent. That's right. And whatever line of argument you use to arrive at the conclusion that I do not have free will, that line of argument will depend upon premises and steps of reasoning that I probably am less sure of than of my immediate experience of free will. And so it's hard, that's I think the classic defense for free will, and I find it compelling. But
it's kind of the same as a defense against hard solipsism or something.
Yeah. But I want to flip this now. So I think I've been trying to say, even if you grant physics is really, really good at describing the world, and therefore maybe you would land at some kind of determinism or something in that direction of determinism. I don't think that necessarily rules out God, but I want to flip this now and say, like, I don't know, like, do you ever think about the fact that, like, it's really, really cool that we can describe the world really, really well, right?
Yeah.
And does that not cry out for, like, some kind of, well, why is it that humans are such that we are able to understand the world? I mean, there's
Yeah.
several steps there. There's,
Yeah.
why is the universe intelligible, and why is it intelligible by us? Like, so how do you grapple with that?
Well, it's a good question.
Yeah.
I guess I'd say a few things.
Huh.
The first is that, it's
Is
never
that, is
really
that ever suggestive to you?
what.
Do you ever just, like, think about the fact we do science and then you're like, well, maybe there's something else going on?
Well, I'm never sure why questions are useful in some contexts and not in others, right? And so it's sometimes, like, it's sometimes difficult to know what questions are sensible in what contexts.
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't know, repeat your question again, actually. I lost my train of thought.
So I think straightforward is just like, what does it tell us about being human that we can do science, right?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah.
And I think part of it, like, we could point to particular things like, now, like, we have these really great developed models, the standard model, and understanding of the world around us. And maybe, like, originally it sounded like this was, like, leaving less room for God to act.
Yeah.
But it's like, what does the standard model tell us? It's like, well, we have a universe finely tuned, right? We can talk about fine tuning if you want to.
Sure. Okay.
Not just like finely tuned, even more basic than that. Like, we live in a world in which we can understand. Like,
Right.
it's pretty profound. Like, why?
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Yeah. Okay. Good.
And
Okay.
particularly because, like, under Christianity, there's a pretty straightforward explanation, right? Like, and maybe you don't think it's an explanation, and we can talk about that. But,
Sure.
like in science, like in university, I was reading Nietzsche and all these things. And one of the things that I think that really sustained my faith was, like, okay, I see the textual criticism of Genesis, but this basic account that there's a creator who made the universe and then made humanity in the divine image really seems to help me understand why I'm able to understand the world in a deep way.
Yeah, so this is probably just a difference in our experiences, because I found that I had a lot of questions, like the great controversy story did not always make a lot of sense to me, even as a kid.
Well,
and so maybe I'll put that aside and let me go back to the intelligibility of science in the world.
We don't have to make angels and everything into this.
Yeah, so I think that it's a good question.
Yeah.
I would point to the development of human consciousness through evolution. So I think that human minds are adaptive. We have adapted to a whole host of different things. And that has been the single most helpful thing for me in understanding the world, period. The fact that humans and human behavior is adaptive.
Yep.
So our impulses, both harmful and good, are there, if you're looking through an evolutionary lens, for reasons that make sense in our evolutionary history. They helped us in some way, or they helped us procreate in some way. So when I think about things like, why is the world intelligible?
Yeah.
Well, our minds have been adapted to solve certain problems, like, where's the food? Where can I find water? At the same time, our neural hardware has come with a whole bunch of adaptions, like hyperactive agent detection. We are more likely to think that something moving in the grass is a person or an animal that might hurt us. That's our first
to our
jump
survival
reaction.
advantage that we make those assumptions.
Say that
Right?
again?
It's to our advantage that we make those assumptions, right? Like,
Right.
if you're more likely to assume there's a cheetah when there isn't one, rather than to assume there's not a cheetah when there is one,
right? Yeah.
You're more likely to survive, to be a little bit more cautious, right?
Yeah. So I see our ability to do science as just an outgrowth of that. And critically, Like people are always like, you can't trust your minds. Yes, you can't. Don't trust your mind. Like your mind is good for some things and really bad for other things because it's an adapted tool that is shaped by our evolutionary history. So, we have this, now more than ever, we are as a society recognizing this massive bundle of cognitive biases that we all have, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so something as simple as tribalism, like that's adaptive.
Yes.
The fact that, and in fact, I'm actually, so this is a plug for a book I'm reading right now. It's called Moral Tribes. It's really, really helpful.
Who's it by?
I can't remember the name of the author. I could pull it up,
Yeah.
but yeah, Moral Tribes. And essentially, this is a lot of what the book's about. Is that his premise is that morality is essentially an evolved and adaptive suite of psychological tools that we use to interact with other people. And so something like tribalism is adaptive because it helps groups cling together. But tribalism means that you will be more cooperative and helpful with people in the group while being more suspicious and violent towards people outside the group.
Yeah.
And
I am totally down with that. I love Jonathan Haidt's work, The Righteous Mind.
I haven't read that.
Similar evolutionary arguments for why people have different moral instincts that then can lead them to different tribes, and how the tribalism with that. I'm deeply concerned about a lot of like present things around social media that's like reinforcing tribalism. I'm sure we're on the same page there. But I guess like with this evolutionary explanation, I'm a little bit unsatisfied.
Sure, fair.
In that it's just very hard for me to try to understand where in this explanation you get minds that track with truth, right?
Well, it doesn't. That's the thing. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't. Like we have to be, it's a good argument for intellectual skepticism. Like we have to be skeptical of ourselves. We cannot assume that our intuitions are true because they are very often not. But that's why we have reason, right? And that's why we have things like empiricism, which allows us to check our intuition.
So that's what I'm trying to understand. Like, how does reason arise? This is what I'm trying to, because, and maybe this is like a more fundamental tension, but I'm not even sure if I can make sense of reason under like determinism. And so like any like deterministic narrative you give me, I'm not quite sure how you get human reason out of it.
Well, I think that just depends. That would be a problem if you think that libertarian free will is a part of human reason, right? So if you think that libertarian human free will is implicit in human reason, then of course, you're going to think that. I would just describe reason as the set of cognitive tools that helps us check our intuition and come to better explanations about the world. So it's our reasoning power, logic, math, all of these are systems of tools that help us understand the world around us, right?
Yeah. So this is one paper by Eugene Wigner called "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences."
I haven't read the paper, but I've read that. You probably said the same Unbelievable program was on it. Yeah.
Oh, who was that on? Who was that with? I don't remember.
I'm trying to remember. I can't remember who was on it. It was a British philosopher, and I don't recall. But you have to check it out.
I read this when I was an undergrad. I was studying math, and it's just like, man, I would hit my heart was ablaze. It was just thrilling. Like this is all the reason studying math is this. But like it makes a number of points, and one is like mathematics has done an incredibly good job at being internally like consistent. And like we have to be careful, like we've intentionally tried to avoid like contradictions. But there's a line that Wigner puts in there where he says it's kind of his skepticism of like how does natural selection result in minds that are able to create mathematics? So it seems like mathematics is a little bit too powerful for it's not just like survivability. It's like for thousands of years we can build up this abstract structures and the whole system doesn't like fall in like contradiction. Right? It's like, This is more than just like I have 3 berries and I need to collect 10 more berries to survive the winter or something. You probably need
Yeah,
more than
yeah.
13 berries in the winter, but it's like it's a much more sophisticated. Like we have this very like deep and profound ability to reason abstractly,
Hmm.
and that like mathematics tracks with like describing the natural world in these profound ways in which we can make predictions that there exists this thing called the Higgs boson, which is
Hmm.
just crazy.
Yeah,
A
yeah,
few $1 billion billion a particle accelerator and finding it.
yeah.
Right?
Well, I do think that I think there's some real questions there, so I wouldn't want to like just
But
dismiss.
do you feel a force or something? Like there's something there that's kind of like suggesting that maybe our,
Not
no,
frankly, not really. But I mean,
okay,
I'm not a math guy, so that's probably
yeah, yeah,
not.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
just not
Yeah.
my.
I want
But
to tell your heart in the same way as it is.
one thing I would say though, just a general observation on
Yeah.
math and the efficacy of math is that, obviously math is extremely useful in understanding our world, but it's not actually useful in everything. I don't think. I mean, it's great for quantum mechanics. It's not so great for psychology.
Yeah, yeah,
Like so I do think that there is. I do think clearly the base of our cosmos appears to be in some sense mathematical. At least it can be described well by mathematics, so
incredibly
yeah,
well.
yeah, very well, very well.
Yeah, yeah,
But I don't know that it may be the case that any coherent universe that continues for any period of time or subsists at all would have to be mathematically consistent. It is kind of hard for me to imagine a world in which math, like, can you imagine a possible world where math would not work as a tool to describe reality?
yeah. So there's a couple levels though, right? So it's like the one is why is it mathematically structured, and then there's like a further level of like why can we understand that structure? So like that's part of the gap. And there's this story of well, we got better and better at understanding the world to survive, but that story just feels very inadequate to me, right? Now, maybe it's because I don't understand the story well enough. Maybe it's because we don't understand the stories well enough. Maybe in 150 years, our understanding of human evolution will be so much richer. And our understanding of consciousness, our understanding of reason will be so much richer. But for me, this is like one of these areas where, like, I've wrestled with the questions of God does some weird stuff in the Bible, and oh, that thing they told me about, Adam and Eve hanging out 6,000 years ago, that doesn't seem to necessarily check out. But then I like this was the thing, that was like, hey, there's something deeper going on here than just what meets the eye, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe we can start wrapping up. And my question for you, like clearly math is not the thing for you, and that's not the. I mean, not like I'm sure you enjoy it, but that's not the thing that pulls on your heartstrings, right? Like,
Right, yeah.
so what are those areas that like make you skeptical of your skepticism, that make you doubt your doubt, that make you wonder if like empiricism is, I mean, you were just saying that not everything in the world is quantitatively described as great mathematically. Are the things, are there times when you're like, maybe not all of the world is empirically describable? Maybe there's aspects of reality I'm missing out on here, as good as it is to explain.
Sure.
Yeah, what's
Yeah.
the dynamics?
So, I mean, I didn't get into this too much because I just don't, I'm talking about myself mostly here
Yeah,
anyway, and it's
yeah,
like I don't want to give too much into it. But where I basically started was with absolutely nothing, philosophically.
yeah,
And it's sort of the Descartes kind of move, like, okay, what, I think, therefore I am, like, what can I bootstrap myself up from?
yeah,
And empiricism was the answer to me, because I thought, I don't have, maybe this is different for some people.
yeah.
I don't have a internal sort of awareness of the divine. Like, that's not something that sort of makes sense to me.
And that kind of goes back to your childhood story of like,
Right.
there
Yeah.
wasn't this like deep inner spiritual, emotional, however you describe it,
Yeah.
relational aspect.
Right. And I think this is another sort of side thing, but I think people that do have that part of the experience are much more able to hold on to their faith when they encounter the intellectual doubts. I mean, I think that's probably
Are
just.
there any times in your life you think you would say you came close to that? Or was it always just kind of like a mystery? Like, what are my classmates talking about?
No, I mean, I had a series of what I would call sort of like failures. I mean, on prayer walks where I would try to, just like, okay, I just want to feel your presence. Like, I'm not asking for anything specific. Just like, hey, I'm out here in nature walking around, it's just like, and then I just thought, oh, I'm testing God. I shouldn't be testing God. But, but yeah, so I just never, not really. I mean,
I have
through
a Pentecostal friend.
music, actually. That was my,
that's right. That's right.
yeah.
I have this Pentecostal friend who shared, like, growing up, he always felt so bad because he wouldn't speak in tongues, right? Like,
yeah, right. Yeah.
and like, it's like he didn't want to fake it. He's like, I
Yep.
want it to actually happen, but like, it
Yeah.
happened.
Yep.
So maybe it's something. I mean, music, I guess, does.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about music is that, after I left the church, I discovered that I still felt exactly the same way when I listened to music. So like, I still feel that same feeling. Like I still am emotionally engaged by beautiful music. Maybe I'm trying to think if there was any other time when I felt kind of. Oh, the other thing I would say is, the question originally was what, do I ever feel it now, I think. And I do sometimes still think that, for a long time, I actually haven't done it as much recently, but for a number of years, I was still praying every day, just kind of like a check-in, just kind of like, hey,
Just in case.
Right, because where I was kind of going with the foundational stuff is that if, I was trying to bootstrap my beliefs up from nothing, basically.
Yeah.
So, you have this is a very Humean view, right? So you have your observations and you have your sense perceptions, and you kind of have to make some assumptions about the general trustworthiness of senses, like more or less. It seems like there's a door over there, but maybe I'll go over there and open it. Now I know there's probably a door there and more reason to believe. So that general approach of skepticism and careful investigation of sensory evidence seemed like the best way to go for me because I didn't have access to anything else. That's all I got. So the only other avenue I had to access some kind of a spiritual realm is prayer, basically. I mean, that was what I thought. So maybe meditation. I did try a little bit of meditation, but it's not really my thing. So so I would just pray and be like, hey, like, I don't know what it would do to convince me, but if you're there and you're omnipotent, so
that comes off as a very honest prayer, right?
Right.
It's like, in many ways, like, the prayer of a skeptic is so much more sincere than probably the prayer of many believers who are like, God, I really need this new car, help me, whatever, right?
Well, and part of it is, honestly, the whole time there was a sort of a panicky desperation about it because I didn't want to lose my whole life, and so it was hard to kind of sort through and deal with it.
Is there anything else, like areas of not necessarily like emotional, but just like, hey, this might be a way back to belief, like if there ever was one? I think that, maybe there's something to explore behind that door,
I've been interested in Eastern religions a little bit, and I haven't done sort of deep study into them. So that's something that I kind of, there's a lot of psychological reasons that I think, just based on my personality, that it would be good for me to like get into meditation. So I'm kind of hoping to explore some of that. I just need to be a little bit more persistent. It's like that's why it's going to be good for me, is because it's not sort of like my natural thing. I would say, I think generally speaking, the thing that would bring me back is an experience of some kind. It's probably not an argument because I've kind of seen them all, I think.
And maybe you've also seen how, like, even in your own life, you can kind of like marshal the arguments around your experience,
Sure.
right? Like, sure. I know the arguments pretty well, but it wouldn't take too much from maybe if I had different experience, I could stand on that side of the arguments and I could, yeah.
Yep. Well, my recent reading has been focused on psychology a lot and biases. And, I really think that we humans all make these post hoc rationalizations for the things that we do.
Yeah.
And, if I'm being really honest with myself, I think a lot of the reason that I left was to stop psychological pain, basically.
Yeah.
And it was like, I wouldn't have said that at the time at all, but it was like I had to get out to get away from the pain. And I mean, in this case, it really was what happened. I actually moved to Florida and then went through my intellectual deconstruction. Yeah. So that really is literally it was like sort of taking action. And then, but it wasn't the first. We'd, been kind of thinking about it for a while. But yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. It really is sometimes an emotional motivation for the stuff that we do, and then we fill in the blanks with our reason.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for being vulnerable about that.
Yeah, sure. I've spent most of my life not being vulnerable about anything, so that's kind of like I'm trying to be my thing now. So sometimes I'm vulnerable in my anger, sometimes I'm vulnerable in other ways, but yeah, the emotions are coming out these days. So
yeah. We should probably wind down. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to touch on or talk about.
No, I think this has been really good. It's been sort of wide ranging. I'd be happy to come back and talk about something a little more specific at some point if you ever feel like it.
Yeah, we can do determinism or free will or textual criticism or sexual ethics or science or
yeah, sure.
Any of the topics we touched on.
Yeah. Happy to. No, I really appreciate you suggesting this, Anthony. It's been really fun. I hope somebody can get something out of it. I don't know. Yeah, either modeling good conversation or modeling how not to deconstruct or something.
I'm gonna have to listen back later and realize the 1,000 things I missed. And but already I just, it's so beautiful to see someone's story played out.
Oh, thanks.
No, I love hearing more of your story and some touch points and some parallels. And it's like, I read that book too. I know that phase of nihilism or whatever. That's really rich. And I tend to think these kinds of things, if it was just up to people figuring out the right thing about God, we would be surely all lost. Yeah. And so if there is some transcendent reality behind my mathematical truths or behind the music we sing, I think God must somehow have to be looking down and smiling at these stories as well and invested in them in some capacity. And I don't know if if God is the good, the true, and the beautiful, I think your life right now is modeling pretty well pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful. Right. So I don't I don't have great anxiety over that. I think I think it's just a beautiful life that you're living right now. So let's stay in touch. Let's keep talking.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks again for the conversation, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to doing it again sometime. Yeah. Thanks.